close your eyes for just a moment. Think about the last time a song made you stop what you were doing. Not just caught your attention, stopped you. Made you turn it up before you even consciously decided to. Made you feel, without entirely understanding why, that whoever made this understood something about the specific texture of human feeling that most music only circles around. You have had that experience with Bruno Mars. Almost everyone has. He has sold more records than almost any artist alive. He has played stadiums on every continent. He has won 15 Grammy Awards. He has written and produced music for himself and for other artists that has collectively generated billions of streams. His Super Bowl halftime performance in 2014 was called one of the greatest in the history of the event by people who have seen all of them. His collaboration with Silk Sonic, the project he made with Anderson. Pac produced an album that critics received as something that shouldn't have been possible. Music so fluent in the language of classic soul that it could have been made 40 years earlier and wouldn't have sounded out of place. He makes it all look easy. It is not easy. Behind the showmanship and the records and the natural genius that the industry credits him with is a story that began in the most pressure-saturated performing environment available to a child, a story about what it costs to be formed entirely by performance before you are old enough to choose it, and about what you find when the applause finally stops for long enough to hear yourself think that you actually want to say. Have you ever been so good at something for so long that the goodness itself became the thing everyone saw while the person behind the goodness was quietly becoming someone that nobody was looking for because nobody was looking past the performance? That is the question at the center of Bruno Mars's story. And the answer, when you follow it all the way through, is one of the most genuinely instructive things in contemporary music. It is February 2nd, 2014, MetLife Stadium, East Rutherford, New Jersey. Super Bowl XLVE halftime. Bruno Mars walks to the center of the stage. He is 28 years old. He has been performing professionally since he was 4. He has had 3 #1 albums, multiple #1 singles, a Grammy for Record of the Year, and a career that has been ascending since 2010 with a consistency that the music industry rarely produces and almost never sustains. He is also, at this moment, performing for the largest live television audience in American broadcast history, approximately 115 million people. He opens with Locked Out of Heaven. By the time the performance ends 12 minutes later, having moved through Treasure, Runaway Baby, and an extended finale with the Red Hot Chili Peppers, the consensus forming in real time on social media and into broadcast booths, and in the living rooms of 100 million American homes, is that something genuinely extraordinary has just happened. Not just an entertainer performing well, something more specific. A person who was so completely at home in that space, the largest performance space in the world, that the performance itself seemed to cost him nothing. It cost him everything. Not in the moment. In the 24 years of daily formation that made the moment possible. This story does not begin at the Super Bowl. It begins in Honolulu, Hawaii, in 1985. In a family where performance was not a choice, but a condition of existence, where the stage was the living room, the audience was the family, and the training began before the child being trained could form a long-term memory of its starting. Pull back far enough from the Grammy Awards and the stadium concerts and the producer credits and the Silk Sonic album and the residency in Las Vegas that sold out before most people knew it was being announced, and you find the beginning. The actual beginning, which is not the story of a naturally gifted child who one day discovered music. It is the story of a child who was born into music before he had any say in the matter, and who spent the first 20 years of his life being shaped by that birth. Peter Gene Hernandez was born on October 8, 1985, in Honolulu, Hawaii. He was the 6th of 7 children in a family where music was not a hobby or a career aspiration, but the central organizing principle of daily life. His father, Pete Hernandez, was a musician of Filipino and Puerto Rican descent who led a band called the Love Notes. His mother, Bernadette, was a hula dancer and singer of Filipino and Native Hawaiian descent. His uncles were musicians. His brothers and sisters were performers. The family performed together. This is not a metaphor. They performed together professionally as a family act in Waikiki, the hotel strip and tourist entertainment circuit that has been one of the primary commercial music environments in Hawaii for decades. They were good at it. They were a family who understood performing not as something extraordinary that some people were lucky enough to do, but as the work, the thing you did, because it was what you were, and because the audience needed what you had. Bruno Mars was performing on that stage by the time he was 4 years old. 4 years old. He was doing Elvis impersonations. He had the movements, the voice shaping, the showmanship, the specific physical vocabulary of a performance tradition he had been absorbing since before he could walk. The tourists would stop. The tourists would take photographs. The family would continue performing. He was named after Bruno Sammartino, the professional wrestler, by a father who saw the same quality in his infant son, that Sammartino had a physical presence that filled a room before it did anything in particular. By the time he was 4, the room was already learning what his father had already known. The childhood that followed was saturated with performance in the way that some childhoods are saturated with a particular religion or a particular set of family values, not as something chosen, but as the atmospheric condition of growing up. He went to school. He did school things. He also performed with the family in the Waikiki entertainment circuit in ways that blurred the line between rehearsal and performance and daily life until the three things were indistinguishable. He moved to Los Angeles at 17 to pursue a music career. His family had built in him, by that point, something that the music industry spends enormous amounts of money trying to manufacture in artists who are acquired, rather than formed the specific fluency of a performer who is not performing a version of themselves, but simply being themselves in front of an audience. Because the performing and the being have never been distinguishable. He arrived in Los Angeles with that fluency and almost nothing else. Have you ever had a gift that was so thoroughly built into you by your environment, by your family, by the specific conditions of your childhood, that you arrived at the age of independence with enormous capability and almost no experience of who you were outside the context that produced the capability? That is the specific inheritance of Bruno Mars's childhood. The gift was genuine. The gift was also the only self that had been constructed yet. And Los Angeles was about to present him with the question of who he was when the family act was over and the stage was his to define entirely on his own terms. Los Angeles did not receive him well. This is the part of the Bruno Mars story that the Grammy speeches and the Super Bowl celebrations tend to compress into a brief allusion to early struggles before the first hit. The actual years in Los Angeles, the 5 years between his arrival at 17 and the release of his debut single at 24, were not a brief pause before the career began. They were the education. He was signed to Motown Records. He was dropped. The label had signed a persona, the Elvis impersonating child performer from Hawaii, and what they found when they actually worked with him was something different and harder to categorize. He was not trying to impersonate anything. He had developed, out of the family formation and the Waikiki years and the specific musical education of a child raised in a household where every genre was available and respected. A sensibility that was genuinely singular, a musical intelligence that moved between funk and R&B and soul and pop and reggae and rock with the ease of someone who had absorbed all of them simultaneously rather than arriving at each one sequentially. The label could not figure out what to do with this. They dropped him. He was 19 years old in Los Angeles with no record deal and no clear path, and the specific difficulty of a person who has been formed entirely for performance and who is discovering that being formed for performance is not the same as being prepared for the business of performance. He could have gone home. He did not go home. He started writing. Not performing writing. For himself and eventually for other artists. He connected with a songwriter and producer named Philip Lawrence, and then with a production duo called the Smeezingtons. And he began the slow, specific, frequently unrewarded process of developing not just as a performer, but as a songwriter and a producer, as someone who understood music not just from the outside where the audience sees it, but from the inside where it is constructed. The writing years were unglamorous in the specific way of work that is building something before anyone can see what is being built. He was not charting. He was not performing in the venues that matched the ambition the Waikiki years had installed in him. He was in rooms, working, developing a craft that the family formation had given him the foundation for, but had not given him the full language of. He was learning for the first time what he actually had to say, not what a 4-year-old Elvis impersonator on a Waikiki stage had to say, but what a 20-year-old from Honolulu who had absorbed every form of Black American music and every tradition of Hawaiian performance and every lesson that a childhood of professional performing had deposited in him actually had to say when the stage was his and the material was his, and nobody else was directing the show. He wrote songs that other people recorded. He wrote Billionaire for Travis McCoy, which became a top 10 hit. He wrote Nothin' on You for B.O.B., which went to number 1. He wrote Just the Way You Are for himself, which also went to number 1. By the time the world heard Bruno Mars's voice for the first time on his own recordings, it was hearing a voice that had spent 5 years in Los Angeles becoming something that his 4-year-old self could not have been: a musician, rather than simply a performer, a person who understood what he was making, not just how to present it. The distinction matters more than it might appear. The Waikiki years gave him the ability to hold a room. The Los Angeles years gave him something to say. There is a version of Bruno Mars's story that the music industry tells very comfortably. The child prodigy who grew into the consummate professional, the entertainer who works harder than anyone else, who brings more to a stage than anyone else, who has earned every award and every accolade through sheer quality of output. That version is accurate. The version underneath it is about the specific weight of having been formed so completely by performance that the private self, the person who existed when the stage was empty and the family was not watching, and the audience was not there, took years to locate. He has spoken about this in interviews that the entertainment press tends to receive as charming anecdotes rather than as the genuinely complicated psychological territory they occupy. He has spoken about the pressure of the family formation, the expectation that was never stated as an expectation, because it was simply the condition of being alive in that household. He has spoken about the difficulty of Los Angeles, not just the practical difficulty of being dropped from a label, but the more fundamental difficulty of figuring out who he was when the family act was over. He has spoken about the night in 2010 when he was arrested for cocaine possession in Las Vegas, an arrest that was public and that could have been the moment that reorganized the narrative of his career around the familiar celebrity failure arc. He has said that the arrest was a moment of genuine personal reckoning, that the accumulation of the pressure of the formation and the years of building in Los Angeles and the sudden commercial success that had arrived in the previous months had produced in him a state that he recognized, in retrospect, as someone who had not yet developed the private resources to manage what the public life was. Producing. He was 24 years old. He had just had his first #1 hit. He was not managing the success well. The specific texture of that period, the gap between the professional arrival and the personal readiness for what the arrival meant, is something that Bruno Mars has described with an honesty that his public persona, which runs at approximately twice the wattage of most public personas, does not always make room for. He had the skill. He had the formation. He had the instincts that 4 years old on a Waikiki stage and 19 years old writing songs in Los Angeles had deposited in him. What he did not yet have was a stable sense of who was using those instincts, and why, and what for. He has also said that the reckoning produced something useful, a clarity about what mattered and what didn't, about who he was performing for and why, about the difference between the showmanship that the family had built in him and the authenticity that the showmanship was supposed to serve. The clarity produced some of the finest music of his career. Have you ever had a moment, a very public, very uncomfortable reckoning, a moment you did not choose and could not manage, that turned out to be the thing that organized everything that came after it? That is what the Las Vegas arrest was for Bruno Mars. Not a scandal, a clarification. What Bruno Mars built in the decade after that clarification is not simply a commercial record. It is a coherent artistic statement, one of the more unusual things to find in the center of the pop mainstream, where coherence tends to be sacrificed in favor of relevance and the pressure to adapt to whatever the moment's sound is. Bruno Mars has never adapted to the moment's sound. He has created the moment's sound, and the distinction is the difference between an artist and a service provider. Unorthodox Jukebox in 2012. That's What I Like in 2017, which won the Grammy for Record of the Year, Song of the Year, and Album of the Year, a rare sweep that had been achieved by only a handful of artists before him. The Silk Sonic collaboration with Anderson, .Paak and Evening with Silk Sonic, released in 2021, which produced the single Leave the Door Open, which won Grammy Awards for Record of the Year and Song of the Year, giving Bruno Mars the distinction of winning those awards in consecutive years with two completely different projects. The critical and commercial record is extraordinary. But the thing that the record doesn't capture is the specific coherence of the artistic vision underneath it. Bruno Mars has made, across the entirety of his commercial career, music that is in explicit conversation with the tradition he was formed in the soul and R&B and funk and pop tradition of the mid-20th century, while simultaneously being completely of the present moment. He has never been a nostalgia act. He has never been a revivalist. He has been, instead, someone who understood the tradition deeply enough to speak its language fluently while using that language to say something new. This is the rarest possible thing in contemporary popular music. The central irony of Bruno Mars's career is this: the child who was formed entirely by performance, who had no experience of himself outside the context of performing, became, in the years when the formation was finally tested and found incomplete, an artist who understood that the performance was only as good as the truth it was serving. The showmanship was always there. What the Los Angeles years and the Las Vegas reckoning gave him was something to show. In 2026, Bruno Mars is 40 years old. He is midway through a residency at the MGM Grand Garden Arena in Las Vegas, a residency that was announced with limited advance promotion and sold out almost immediately, confirming what 40 years of evidence has established: there is no performer in contemporary popular music who commands a room the way Bruno Mars commands a room. He has spoken, in the period after the Silk Sonic success and in the years since, with a directness about his own story that his earlier public persona, carefully managed, relentlessly upbeat, the showmanship deployed as a kind of protective surface, had not always permitted. He speaks about the family formation with warmth and with the honest complexity of someone who understands both what it gave him and what it cost him. He speaks about the Los Angeles years with a specific gratitude of someone who knows that the difficulty was the education. He speaks about his mother, Bernadette, who died in 2013 at the age of 55 from a sudden brain aneurysm, with a grief that has informed his music in ways that he has not always articulated directly, but that is audible in the emotional register of everything he has made since. His mother died during the period of his greatest commercial success. He was 27. He had just broken through to the kind of global fame that the Waikiki stages and the Los Angeles years and the Las Vegas reckoning had all been building toward. The person who had formed him, who had danced alongside him on the Waikiki stage when he was 4 years old, who had been the living embodiment of everything the family formation had put into him, who had seen the beginning, and who he had always assumed would see the rest was gone before she could see what it had all become. He has said, in the careful and limited way that he speaks about her, that her death changed something in him that no Grammy Award and no stadium show and no critical consensus can reach. That what changed was not the ambition or the work ethic or the showmanship, all of those survived intact. What changed was the understanding of what the work was for, who it was ultimately for, what it meant to be given the gift and to have the person who first saw the gift, no longer present, to see where the gift went. He has made music since that loss that carries it, not overtly, not as a subject, but as a weight the specific emotional gravity of someone who knows what they are singing about, because the feeling being described is not an artistic exercise, but the actual content of lived experience. He is, at 40, both the most polished performer in contemporary popular music and the artist most clearly in the process of becoming something beyond the polish. The showmanship remains. What is being shown has deepened. There is something quietly remarkable about that image, a man who was performing for audiences at 4 years old, who was dropped from his first record deal and rebuilt himself from the inside out, who won Grammy Awards for Record of the Year in consecutive years with different projects, who lost his mother at the peak of his success and kept making music that was in conversation with the loss standing in the center of a stage in Las Vegas at 40 years old, still the most commanding presence in the room, and still, after 36 years of performance, finding new things to say. Bruno Mars's story is not a story about talent. It is not a story about the Grammy Awards or the Super Bowl halftime performance or the Silk Sonic collaboration or the residency or the record sales. It is a story about the specific labor of becoming an artist inside a formation that produced a performer, about what has to be developed independently. In the absence of applause, in the years when the stage is empty and the family is not watching and the audience is not there. About the difference between being shaped by performance and choosing, consciously and with full self-knowledge, what to perform. It is also a story about what grief does to a voice, about the specific deepening that happens when someone who has always been able to make you feel something discovers what it is to feel something that is not available to the craft that cannot be performed, only carried. And about what the music becomes when the carrying is also the making. We live in a world that celebrates the gift. We look at what Bruno Mars does on a stage and we see something that seems to have arrived fully formed, the showmanship, the instincts, the specific physical intelligence of a performer who has always known what to do with a room, and we call it genius, which it is. But genius built entirely from formation without self-determination is not yet complete, and the work of Bruno Mars's life, the work that the Grammy Awards do not quite capture, has been the work of completing it. What are you building in the quiet hours in the space where the performance is not required, where nobody is watching, where the only question is what you actually want to say? What are you developing that the formation didn't give you? Leave that in the comments, because that is not a question about music. It is the question that Bruno Mars has been answering, song by song and year by year, since he was 19 years old in Los Angeles and the stage was finally, entirely, and terrifyingly his own. If this story moved something in, you leave a like. 1 second. It means this story finds someone who needs it. Subscribe. More stories like this are coming, artists who built what they needed to say in the years when nobody was listening. And tell me in the comments, what is the one thing from Bruno Mars's story that you carry forward? Because the most important performance he has ever given was not at the Super Bowl. It was in a room in Los Angeles alone at 19 years old, when there was no audience and no family and no stage. And he stayed and started writing. We'll be back.